10,890 square feet. An ordinary suburban lot most people mow without a second thought. Laid out correctly, that same quarter acre becomes the last amount of land a family of 4 will ever need. Not supplement the grocery bill, not reduce it slightly, replace almost the entire thing outright. Every produce category, most of the protein, 12 months of fruit, and enough preserved food to skip winter shopping entirely. The families who pull this off are not trained farmers or seasoned homesteading experts of any kind. They are ordinary people who learned the correct layout and built it one zone at a time, deliberately. Most people underestimate how much a single well-planned zone can change an entire property's output. The families who fail on a quarter acre are not lazier than anyone else attempting the same thing. They simply started with the wrong design from the very first shovel in the ground. This video lays out the layout that actually works. 8 zones, specific sizing, specific species, specific sequence. The average American family spends well over $15,000 on groceries every single year. A quarter acre built on this exact layout absorbs most of that bill within roughly 2 growing seasons. That single distinction between supplementing and replacing groceries is worth sitting with for a moment. None of the math involved is complicated, and none of the required work is genuinely heroic in scale. The layout simply has to be right from the start, which is exactly what beginners rarely get taught. Here is what most people actually do the moment they get a quarter acre of their own to work with. A vegetable garden goes into one corner, maybe 400 square feet of tomatoes, peppers, and zucchini. That kind of clarity about calories versus flavor changes how an entire garden gets planned from day one. A chicken coop goes near the back fence. 6 hens inside a store bought coop costing around $400. The rest of the property becomes lawn that gets mowed every single week at real ongoing cost. That garden produces genuine abundance in August and almost nothing across the other 46 weeks of the year. $50 to $60 a month goes toward chicken feed, while only $40 in eggs comes back. Calling that arrangement homesteading is generous, since it functions as 2 completely disconnected hobbies running in parallel. The garden has no real connection to the chickens, and the chickens have no real connection to the compost. Fruit trees sit scattered with no real thought given to shade, foraging, or any kind of fertility loop. Nothing on that property feeds anything else, and every single input arrives from somewhere outside the fence. Every bag of feed, every bag of fertilizer, and every February grocery run once the summer harvest is long gone. That is not a land problem, since the land itself is already sitting there available and unused. That is not a motivation problem either, since plenty of effort clearly went into the attempt already. Recognizing that pattern early is often the difference between a rewarding project and a quiet money pit. That is a layout problem, and layout problems happen to have exact, repeatable solutions available. The correct layout rarely gets taught because the correct layout stops turning anyone into a repeat customer. A quarter acre producing its own fertility, growing its own animal feed, and preserving its own harvest buys almost nothing. Fertilizer bags, feed bags, replacement plants, and commercial preserves all stop getting purchased every spring. No feed company profits from a property running comfrey and black soldier fly larvae instead of purchased bags. No fertilizer brand profits from a worm bin, quietly producing 25 pounds of castings every single month. So the exact layout that generates all of that rarely shows up anywhere in a glossy magazine spread. What performs well on social media is the beautiful raised bed, the cute coop, and the perfect harvest photo. What does not perform on social media is a feed closure system, a hoop house running through January, and a small market strip. That unglamorous market strip quietly pays for every purchased input the whole operation still genuinely needs. Those specific zones generate the best return per dollar of any infrastructure sitting anywhere on the property. Nobody teaches them, because most beginner content creators depend on their audience remaining a lifelong buyer. Before covering the actual zones, some historical proof is worth sitting with for a moment first. A 1918 government poster stated plainly that table and kitchen waste could provide much of a flock's feed. Hens ran directly on household waste streams, while gardens ran on manure produced by those same hens. That kind of dependency was never really an accident. It was simply how the industry preferred things to run. The whole system fed itself at close to zero ongoing cost across an entire household's yearly needs. During World War II, 20 million American families planted victory gardens across countless small backyards nationwide. Old government guidance rarely gets revisited today, yet it quietly proves this exact approach worked before. Those backyard gardens produced roughly 40% of all fresh vegetables grown across the entire country. None of that came from commercial farms. All of it came from ordinary household backyards instead. Meanwhile, 65 million Russian families ran small dacha plots averaging 6,500 square feet each. Those same small plots produced roughly 40% of Russia's entire food supply during that same era. In Cuba during 1991, a fertilizer import collapse of roughly 80% forced an entire country to adapt overnight. Urban garden plots across city lots rebuilt the entire national food system within less than a decade. Those same urban plots supplied roughly 90% of Havana's fresh produce by the end of that decade. These systems all worked because every single zone fed the next one, and nothing left the property unnecessarily. A quarter acre built on this exact layout runs on those same proven principles tested across entire centuries. First, the calorie core, the single zone that determines whether a quarter acre becomes a real food system. Most beginners plant flavor crops first, and tomatoes are roughly 94% water by actual weight. Lettuce runs close to 96% water, meaning a mountain of both still leaves a family needing staples. Calories feed a family through winter. Flavor alone simply cannot carry that same weight nutritionally. Fertility that regenerates itself year after year is worth more than any bag of purchased amendment. History rarely gets brought into modern gardening content, yet it proves this approach at genuine scale. This calorie core takes up 25% of total growing space, roughly 1,500 to 2,000 square feet. It grows only calorie-dense staples: potatoes, sweet potatoes, dry beans, winter squash, garlic, and flower corn where climate allows. 100 square feet of potatoes using intensive spacing produces roughly 35,000 calories within 65 days. That is more than a full week of complete meals for one adult from a single garden bed alone. 500 square feet of that same crop covers one adult's entire caloric needs across a full year. 400 square feet of dry beans produces roughly 40 to 50 pounds of dried protein annually. Garlic planted in October and pulled the following July occupies calorie beds during their natural off-season entirely. That single rotation produces 12 full months of shelf-stable value from the exact same patch of ground. This zone alone marks the real difference between a property that supplements groceries and one that replaces them outright. Second, the daily kitchen beds, fast-cycling vegetables positioned within 15 to 20 feet of the back door. Salad beds sitting 200 feet from the kitchen get skipped on busy evenings in favor of a store run. Beds sitting 15 feet from the kitchen door get harvested every single morning without much conscious thought at all. Walking distance functions as the actual management system, and proximity directly equals real harvest frequency over time. This zone takes up 15% of the total quarter acre, roughly 1,600 square feet in total. It runs continuous succession planting, a fresh row of lettuce, spinach, arugula, or radishes every 2 weeks from March through October. That single zone decision ripples through every other zone built afterward on the same property. Proximity to a kitchen door is a detail most garden plans overlook until harvest habits get tracked honestly. That same 1,600 square feet generates 6 to 9 distinct harvests per season, instead of just 2. Staked cherry tomatoes, trained on simple cattle panel arches, produce 3 to 5 pounds per square foot of bed. Cucumbers on additional arches produce 2 to 3 pounds from ground that simultaneously doubles as a walking path. In November, simple cold frames built from an old window and a wooden box extend harvest through January at zero heat cost. Third, the perennial orchard and berry layer, one planting delivering decades of harvest with almost no repeat effort. This zone takes up 20% of the total quarter acre available across the whole property. A 40-foot blackberry hedge along a north-facing fence produces 100 to 200 pounds of fruit yearly. 8 blueberry bushes produce 40 to 80 pounds annually across a productive lifespan stretching 25 years. 8 to 10 dwarf fruit trees spaced 8 feet apart along a south fence yield 400 to 800 pounds yearly. Full production from those same trees typically arrives somewhere between year 4 and year 6 after planting. A grape arbor, built over a primary walking corridor, adds 30 to 60 pounds per vine from shared space. That same space functions simultaneously as a circulation path, doubling its practical value on the property. Asparagus planted once in year 1 continues producing for 20 to 30 years from that single original planting. Jerusalem artichokes along east and west fence lines bank potato-equivalent calories underground every single autumn. They also grow 6 to 10 feet tall, functioning as a genuine windbreak along those same fence lines. Walking distance sounds like a minor detail until an entire season of harvests depends on it. Year 1 of this zone looks like almost nothing worth mentioning on the surface at all. Year 5 feels like the entire property's output shifted into a completely different category altogether. Anyone who skips planting this zone first typically spends 3 full years recovering from that original decision. Fourth, the complete protein station, made possible by the extra space a quarter acre provides over smaller lots. A property that keeps producing for decades from one planting rewards patience more than almost anything else. A quarter acre supports 4 separate species simultaneously that a smaller tenth of an acre simply cannot support. Those 4 species are Coturnix quail, meat rabbits, heritage-laying hens, and Muscovy ducks running together. A 3-tier quail rack covering 32 square feet houses 60 to 100 Coturnix hens comfortably. Those hens lay 250 to 300 eggs yearly each on roughly 60 cents a feed monthly. That single rack produces 15,000 to 30,000 eggs annually from a genuinely tiny footprint. One buck alongside 3 to 4 dozen 40 to 60 square feet of stacked hutches produces real meat volume. That setup yields 300 to 500 pounds of meat yearly at a documented 3-to-1 feed conversion. 8 heritage hens in 100 to 30 square feet add 1,600 to 2,000 eggs per year on their own. Those same hens control pests in the orchard through rotational fencing while producing compost that feeds the calorie core. A Muscovy trio on a 60 square foot pad forages 30 to 50% of its own food naturally. Each bird dresses at 6 to 8 pounds with a feed conversion around 2.7 to 1. A single planting that pays off for decades is rare in almost any other part of home food production. That trio self-replenishes at zero additional cost once the original breeding group is properly established. Surplus from this entire station, quail eggs and rabbit meat sold direct, becomes the first real income stream. Fifth, the feed closure system, not a dedicated space, but an integrated network running along every fence line. It runs under every hutch and behind every shed, rather than occupying any single dedicated footprint of its own. 3 components make up this system, starting with Russian comfrey planted along the entire perimeter fence line. Comfrey runs 20 to 25% protein by dry weight, with 4 to 6 cuttings possible per season. That same rootstock keeps producing for decades from what used to be completely dead fence line space. It produces 500 to 800 pounds of free protein annually from ground that once did nothing. A black soldier fly larvae bin running on kitchen scraps forms the second component of this feed system. 1 pound of food waste daily becomes roughly 7 pounds of fresh larvae weekly through that same bin. Those larvae carry 40 to 45% crude protein, displacing $50 to $80 of feed monthly. A worm bin sitting under the rabbit hutches forms the third and final component of this closed loop. Rabbit manure drops straight through wire floors into red wigglers producing 15 to 30 pounds of castings monthly. Running several species together, instead of just one, is what actually makes a small footprint feel abundant. That vermicompost sells for $3 to $7 per pound at retail prices in most gardening communities. These 3 systems together replace 40 to 60% of commercially purchased feed within a single season. 4 species running together on the same footprint is exactly what smaller lots simply cannot support. They also eliminate external fertilizer purchases entirely for well under $200 total setup cost. Sixth, the hoop house, a structure every beginner guide calls optional, and every experienced grower calls essential. A closed loop feeding system is the quiet engine behind almost every number covered so far. A 20 by 40 foot structure covering 800 square feet gets built from cattle panels and thick polysheeting. That entire structure goes up for under $600 in materials from most local hardware suppliers. It shifts effective growing climate by 1.5 to 2 full growing zones warmer than outside. In winter, it holds salad greens in active production at essentially zero additional heating cost involved. In early spring, it starts every transplant, tomatoes, peppers, squash, and cucumbers, that would otherwise cost real money at a nursery. That single structure eliminates an annual purchase of $100 to $200 once it starts running. In summer, it produces 3 to 5 times the volume per square foot compared to equivalent outdoor beds. That happens because the controlled environment adds 6 to 8 extra weeks to the warm growing season. It also eliminates wind damage that regularly reduces yields in fully exposed outdoor growing areas nearby. The hoop house alone produces 5,000 to 8,000 pounds of food yearly from its modest footprint. Building it in year 1 makes it the highest return infrastructure investment across the entire quarter acre. 7th, the preservation station, since growing 12 months of food means little if most of it rots first. An August harvest of 100 pounds of tomatoes overwhelms most families before they can consume it all. That kind of feed closure is what actually separates a self-sufficient property from an expensive one. Without proper storage, the whole system produces in short surges and quietly starves through winter months. The preservation station lives in a corner of a garage or basement, costing surprisingly little to assemble. A pressure canner running $80 to $100 handles beans, tomatoes, and meat throughout the year. A food dehydrator running $50 to $100 handles herbs, dried fruits, and homemade jerky easily. A buried trash can root cellar, costing under $20 in colder climate zones, holds potatoes for months. That same simple setup holds garlic for 6 to 12 months, depending on curing and storage conditions. A chest freezer running $200 to $400 handles meat, berries, and early season vegetables. A fermentation shelf kept at room temperature produces sauerkraut, pickles, and lacto-fermented garlic year-round. All 5 components together cost under $1,000 total to fully assemble from scratch. Together, they turn 6 weeks of summer abundance into 10 full months of steady household consumption. They also eliminate grocery spending on canned goods, frozen vegetables, and pantry staples entirely on their own. 6 to 8 extra weeks of growing season is the kind of advantage most outdoor beds simply cannot match. 8th, the market edge, the single zone nobody teaches, and the one that changes every other zone's economics. Every quarter acre running correctly eventually produces more food than any single family can actually eat. Quail eggs exceed household consumption by roughly month 3 of running the full protein station. The rabbit colony produces more meat than any one family typically eats across a full calendar year. A structure this simple, paying for itself this quickly, is rare anywhere else on a small property. The berry hedge by year 3 produces so much fruit that bags get given away to neighbors constantly. That surplus is never really waste. It functions as genuine inventory, sitting ready to generate income instead. The market edge occupies 100 to 200 square feet of high value, fast cycling crops specifically. Those crops get grown specifically for direct sale, covering whatever inputs the whole system still genuinely needs. Baby salad greens, ready in 30 days from seed, produce 4 to 6 pounds per 100 square feet. Those greens sell for $8 to $12 per pound when sold direct to local customers. Microgreens grown in just 72 hours inside a winter hoop house sell for $20 to $30 per flat. Edible flowers from nasturtiums and calendula, planted as companions throughout the calorie zone, need no dedicated footprint. Those same edible flowers sell for $15 to $20 per quarter pound at local markets. 2 market mornings a week from this small strip covers every purchased input the entire operation still requires. It often generates an additional $300 to $600 per month beyond covering those costs. 200 square feet of baby greens producing 5 pounds every 30 days at $10 a pound works out clearly. That comes out to roughly $1,000 monthly from a bed the size of a single parking space. This is exactly what makes a quarter acre financially self-sustaining, rather than just an expensive ongoing hobby. Every experienced grower eventually adds this exact zone once the rest of the system starts producing surplus. A pantry stocked through winter changes how a household experiences the coldest months of the year. Preserving a harvest properly is just as important as growing it in the first place. No beginner guide explains it clearly, because no outside sponsor profits from a homestead covering its own costs. There was a point roughly 2 years into running a quarter acre before any of this actually clicked properly. Storage capacity ends up mattering just as much as growing capacity once a harvest actually comes in. 400 square feet of raised beds, 18 tomato plants, and 12 hens in a store-bought coop. A food budget that genuinely did not move by even $1 across 2 full years of effort. The garden produced real August abundance and essentially nothing worthwhile for the rest of the entire year. The hens returned $40 in eggs against $58 in feed spent every single month. Fruit trees produced nothing in year 2 simply because they got planted in entirely the wrong location. The compost pile sat mostly unused because it sat 40 feet away from the actual kitchen door. 8 separate pieces of one property existed, with nothing meaningfully feeding into anything else at all. Every single zone functioned as an isolated expense, rather than part of any connected working system. In month 24, the entire layout finally got redesigned from the ground up with real intention. The calorie core went in first, replacing 14 tomato plants with potatoes and dry beans instead. The quail rack then moved directly next to the worm bin, and the loops finally started connecting properly. By month 4, a comfrey hedge went in along the west fence line of the property. Selling small, fast cycling crops is what turns leftover surplus into a genuine, repeatable income stream. By month 7, the hoop house went up, delivering its very first winter crop shortly afterward. Surplus turning into income is the detail that quietly changes the entire financial picture of a homestead. By month 14, the monthly grocery bill had dropped by roughly $260 overall. None of that came from working harder, using the same land, the same hours, and the same daily effort. The layout itself was the only variable that ever genuinely changed across that entire process. Here are 6 mistakes that quietly kill this whole system before it ever earns anything meaningful back. First mistake, starting with decorative zones instead of the calorie core that actually feeds a family. Potatoes take 65 days, dry beans take 90, and salad greens can genuinely wait a bit longer. The foundation cannot wait though, since everything else in the system depends on that core being established first. Second mistake, building isolated systems instead of a genuinely connected one across the entire property. Animals kept in isolation function purely as expenses, rather than as part of a working, connected loop. Stacking the quail above the worm bin beside the rabbit hutches next to compost is the real geometry that matters. Third mistake, skipping the hoop house entirely because it initially sounds like an optional luxury item. That structure only sounds optional until 2 lost growing seasons, and annual transplant purchases get properly calculated. Building it in year 1 avoids years of unnecessary cost that compound quietly in the background otherwise. Fourth mistake, skipping the preservation station, treating August abundance rotting away as a growing problem instead. It is actually a storage problem, and it should get solved in the very same season as the calorie core. 2 years of real numbers are worth more than any amount of hopeful guessing on paper. Fifth mistake, choosing the wrong genetics entirely for laying hens without checking actual production numbers first. A decorative breed might lay 150 eggs yearly, while a proper production breed lays over 260. That production breed also holds strong output for 6 full years instead of tapering off quickly. The wrong breed becomes a hidden expense that rarely gets properly audited until year 3 rolls around. Sixth mistake, trying to build all 8 zones within a single season instead of spreading the work sensibly. 2 years minimum realistically makes sense, with zones 1 and 2 going in during season 1. Zone 3 gets established at the end of season 1, so it can properly settle over winter. Redesigning a layout after 2 flat years is proof that effort alone was never really the missing ingredient. Zones 4 and 6 go in during season 2, once the earlier foundation zones are fully working. Zone 8 goes in during season 3, once genuine surplus exists that is actually ready to sell. Picture a quarter acre, exactly like this one, 3 full years into running the complete 8-zone system. Avoiding these specific mistakes early saves years of frustration compared to learning them the hard way. The calorie core produces steadily from March straight through October without much additional intervention required. Kitchen beds, cold frames, and the hoop house together supply fresh food across all 12 months of the year. The orchard sits in year 4, with apple trees producing roughly 60 pounds each that particular fall. The quail rack has fully covered its own feed cost since roughly month 4 of running the system. The rabbit colony delivers meat at around $3 per pound, compared to $12 at a butcher shop. The preservation station shelved over 300 jars of food across that single fall season alone. The root cellar holds 60 pounds of garlic, 140 pounds of potatoes, and 40 pounds of dried beans. The grocery store becomes an occasional stop for flour, coffee, and salt rather than a weekly necessity. Produce prices stopped being tracked closely roughly 6 months earlier, since they stopped really mattering. None of that insulation from rising prices came from luck, extra money, or living somewhere especially unusual. It came entirely from deliberate design applied consistently across every single zone of the property. Every mistake here came from real experience rather than theoretical advice untested on an actual property. That kind of steady, sequenced progress compounds in ways a single rushed season never quite manages. The land itself never changed, and the hours put into it never really changed either across that time. Only the layout changed, and the layout turned out to be the only thing that ever truly needed changing. The same quarter acre, sequenced correctly, does more with every passing season without needing more land bought. So here is a genuine question worth sitting with. Which of these 8 zones would go in first on any given property? A property that insulates a household from rising prices is worth far more than its raw harvest numbers. Drop that answer in the comments below, since every single one gets read and considered carefully afterward. If this layout changed how a property gets looked at, hitting subscribe brings new breakdowns like this weekly. A quarter acre is not a hobby quietly waiting to happen somewhere in the background of daily life. It is a complete food system waiting patiently to be properly designed and built one zone at a time.